For a reaction to all of this, we're happy to be joined by Kentucky Senator Rand Paul. Senator, it's great to see you. Thanks so much for coming on the program.
Good morning.
Good morning to you. There's a lot we want to discuss, but let's start with your reaction to the Electoral College officially casting 306 votes for Joe Biden yesterday. Also, what you made of Biden's speech. He said this was a free and fair election and that the people have spoken. Do you agree with that?
You know, I think what Joe Biden misses and what many people miss is that when you recount or you have a recount of votes, basically, if you haven't validated the votes the first time, if they're invalid, you simply count them again. So really a recount doesn't challenge the validity of votes, and I think we should have done that. With regard to the court cases, the Trump campaign asked for the court cases in order to ask whether the votes were validly cast. So no court really has addressed that issue, and really none of the states have. Now, you would kind of expect Democrat states to ignore the validity of the votes and ignore whether people were alive or dead or whether they were 18 or not. But what's disappointing is in the Republican states like Georgia, controlled by a Republican governor, controlled by a Republican state assembly, that you wouldn't have had some question or some looking into whether or not, there are reports from the Trump campaign that 10,000 people who were deceased voted. There are also reports that tens of thousands of young people who were not 18 and not eligible to vote also voted. There were also reports of people who didn't really live there voting. So that should have been investigated, and no court ever investigated that, and recounts don't address that. The other thing that hasn't been addressed by the courts that's incredibly important moving forward is you can't allow secretaries of state or governors to change election law. Election law, like every other law that's a state law, is set by the legislature. So I think what's important in looking and moving forward is that we make sure that the election law in states that we can control is firm, that the election law can't be changed, and maybe we need to mandate that they review the rolls for people who have committed felonies, for people who are deceased, or for people who are not yet 18. So there needs to be more policing of the election. Unfortunately, there wasn't any in this election, particularly after the fact, and I think that's historically true of all elections. The courts are very good at policing elections afterwards, but it's incumbent upon us for the next election to make sure that we have a valid election the next time.
Well, looking ahead to the next election or validating all of these votes, would you anticipate some sort of voter identification could solve this problem that you say arises?
Well, I have a great idea. You could show up in person, show your ID, show your face, and sign in, and that gets rid of most of the problems. And that's why this election was extraordinary. In the past, well over 95% of people showed up in person, and it was easy to validate who they were. Now you have millions of people who mailed in their ballots, and it's virtually impossible. I mean, if you really wanted to know if it was truly the person, you'd almost have to have a handwriting expert or a computer program to try to figure out handwriting. But you would also have to check to make sure that people actually applied for the ballots, et cetera. There's so many places for mail-in votes to go wrong, and we've got to get back to traditional voting as the only way we can have honest elections, I think.
Well, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but based on what you're saying, it sounds as though you feel that this election was not an honest one. And so that leads me to my next question here, where a colleague of yours in the House, Congressman Mo Brooks, is leading an effort to block the certification in Congress on January 6th, the results again of the presidential election. Would you support that effort?
I think the place to contest this is at the state legislative level and at the certification level. If a state has already certified it and they've sent their electors and they're voted, I don't know how you change things. The only time it was ever contested was back in the Civil War time, but in those days, I believe the state legislature sent competing electors. So no state has sent us a competing set of electors. So there's not really anything that I know that can be done other than to make a protest. But I'm really intent on making sure that the election as we move forward is honest. The next go-around. The next go-around's only in about 2 weeks. We'll have an election in Georgia, and I'm already concerned about the integrity of the next election in Georgia because they're already mailing. My understanding is the government is mailing applications to people who don't request them. Everybody who voted in November absentee is automatically being mailed a request for a ballot. That's not in the law. That's something the Secretary of State is doing on his own. And that's what we have to, in moving forward, make sure that kind of stuff doesn't happen because that's not in the law. So I am concerned about the January election.
Yeah, raising issues already about that. It's a key election, of course, for the balance of power within the Senate here. I want to switch gears, though, and talk to you about some other news that broke last night. Attorney General Bill Barr stepping down yesterday might not surprise a ton of people, but part of his statement raising eyebrows from Trump supporters, where he said the president, quote, "Your 2016 victory speech in which you reached out to your opponents and called for working together for the benefits of the American people was immediately met by a partisan onslaught against you in which no tactic, no matter how abusive and deceitful, was out of bounds. The nature of this campaign was the effort to cripple, if not oust your administration with frenzied and baseless accusations of collusion with Russia," end quote. So, Senator, do you think Barr did enough to deliver justice to a situation he describes here as abusive and deceitful?
You know, I started out not a big fan of Barr. I didn't vote for his nomination because I think his history in public service, he has not adequately defended civil liberties, so I haven't been a big fan. I do think, though, that some of the criticism is justified and some not. So, for example, people, including the president, wanted him to reveal that Hunter Biden was under investigation before the election. Well, part of our complaint with Comey and others is that they did politicize investigations and had electoral campaign type of investigations during campaign season. So I think it's actually best that we not politicize investigations and that the Department of Justice actually does keep these kind of investigations secret until they're ready to make an indictment. So that I do disagree with the president on. But I would say that overall, Bill Barr and I still disagree on things like the Patriot Act. I wanted reform such that what happened to President Trump could never happen again. I don't think the FISA court, a secret court, should ever be used on a presidential nominee. And because I think it's too powerful, it's secret, it's not really the appropriate American justice form, and it's rife for abuse and was abused against President Trump. So when the battle came forward, I had legislation that would have said, no more. FISA court could never be used against an American again. Bill Barr opposed me in private meetings in the White House, and ultimately he helped to craft legislation that ultimately President Trump said, oh, whatever, he just sort of never signed it. So right now the Patriot Act actually expired, and I compliment President Trump for not going on with the weak sauce sort of reform that Barr and others put forward, and basically he just let it expire. And interestingly, we've been doing just fine under the Constitution for about 9 months without this part of the Patriot Act.
Yeah. Very, very interesting side note there. Just really quick, would you support the idea of a effort to investigate the Bidens at this point, a special counsel?
I think the best way to do it is there's already a U.S. attorney, I believe, in Delaware investigating this. I think that if Biden is going to be honest and fair-minded, he should leave that attorney, U.S. attorney, to continue the investigation of Hunter Biden. Typically, when you get a new president, though, they fire all of the U.S. attorneys and appoint their own. I think if Biden wants us to believe that this is going to be a fair, honest investigation of his son, he should leave that U.S. attorney in place and let him complete the investigation. That'll be a big first signal whether or not we're going to have a fair investigation. If Biden fires this guy and puts in his own person to investigate his son, then we're going to know from the beginning that this is not going to be an honest administration.
Let's talk about this effort underway right now to pardon former national security employee Edward Snowden. Here's what you wrote on Twitter, sending this out, saying James Clapper brazenly lied to Congress, denying that the deep state was spying on all Americans. Snowden simply revealed Clapper's lies and exposed unconstitutional spying. He deserves a pardon from real Donald Trump. Do you see a lot of support for pardoning Snowden? How do you think this could happen, and why do you think it's justified?
Well, you know, a few years ago, we discovered that our spy agencies, the National Security Agency, was spying on all Americans. They were collecting all of your phone data, who you called, how long you spoke to them, whether you called a doctor. You know, there's a lot of things you can infer. In fact, some people think that you can find out more people from metadata than actually conversations. But the government was doing this without the permission of Congress and without the permission of the people. James Clapper, who was head of the intelligence under Obama, was brought before the Senate and asked a question by Senator Wyden. Did you or are you spying on millions of Americans by recording their phone data? He said no. And so he lied to the Senate. That's a felony, and he was never prosecuted, but he should have been. About a month later, Edward Snowden reveals that yes, the American government had lied, and they were spying on all of our phone calls, measuring them, who you called, how long you spoke to the person. And so I think that Edward Snowden was revealing that the government was acting illegally, and that's what a whistleblower does. So yes, I think Edward Snowden ought to be pardoned. I've talked to the president personally about this. I've exchanged emails and advocacy for Edward Snowden being pardoned, and I hope it happens.
Well, you also share a similar viewpoint with the president on the the National Defense Authorization Act here, where you both seem to be against it. Perhaps it's for different reasonings, but you say that the bill would restrict the withdrawal of troops in Afghanistan. Expand on that, if you don't mind, and really explain what you're coming from.
Well, the president agrees with me on this. This was an amendment added by Liz Cheney in the House. This amendment says that the president can't withdraw troops from Germany, South Korea, Afghanistan, below certain numbers without asking permission of Congress. Well, I think this mistakes what the Constitution intended. The Constitution intended that Congress would vote on the initiation of war, that to declare war was Congress's prerogative and you had to have Congress approve of declaring war. But the execution of the war, how many troops would be here, how many Humvees, how many tanks, how many bombers, those kind of decisions were commander-in-chief decisions. Typically, Liz Cheney and the neocons have agreed with us. Yeah, we should leave the president alone and let him fight the war. Except for now, they're taking the opposite position, the hypocritical position that, oh yeah, they're for presidential power, virtually unlimited power in committing war, but they're against letting a president end the war. This has been one of the things I've really agreed with President Trump on, is that we ought to end America's longest war. We're spending $50 billion a year in Afghanistan. That money could be better spent here at home. We got a lot of problems at home, and we need to quit building roads and buildings and hotels and gas stations in Afghanistan. We need to keep that money here at home. And President Trump's been very clear on this, so I support him on that, and that's why I worked and voted against the bill.
That is Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky. Senator, thanks so much for coming on today. We appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you.